story is about growing up with the sense that there are things hidden from you, things that have gone on, that have happened in the past involving your parents, who are now estranged from each other, and you don't really know the full story. So this is where the novel begins, if you like. And so naturally, in due course, we come in, as well as the narrator, comes to find out what it was that had estranged his parents. In the process, he also, of course, discovers many things about himself as well. So that's, in a kind of as an outline, that's what the novel does. That's the shape of it. Yes, the journey is from somebody growing up in Zanzibar who, by chance, is enabled through a relative to come and study in England. That doesn't quite work out exactly as planned. In the meantime, there is in the first place the Zanzibar part of the story of the child growing up there, and the things that he, as I said, comes to understand, the feeling of being ashamed of something that he's not sure of what's going on in his family. And then there is the episode of his life in England, especially when everything doesn't quite work out. And then he returns because he's heard that his father's returned. So he goes back to meet his father. So then the father tells him the story of another time before. So there are in fact several different times, as it were, and places. But the places are, my work very often is kind of basically these two places, Zanzibar and England, with some degree of wandering in between. Gravel heart, really stone heart, a heart of stone. And it's a phrase that comes from Measure for Measure, where the Duke at some point accuses another character, Bernardine, of having a gravel heart, of being too hard-hearted. So that's where it comes from.
That's right.
My mother's name was Saida, and her family had once been well off. Not wealthy by any means, but well off enough to own a piece of farming land and their own house near the courthouse. During her childhood, that part of town was occupied by the grandees, by people connected to the Sultan's government, who lived in the seclusion of their walled gardens, and by European colonial officials, who lived in huge old Arab houses by the sea, and marked their ceremonial imperial rituals with white linen uniforms adorned with fantasy medals, and wore cork helmets festooned with feathers, and carried swords in gilt-edged scabbards like conquerors. They gave themselves tin god titles and pretended that they were aristocrats. Both varieties of grandees thought themselves gifted by nature, which had created them noble and granted them the right to rule as well as the burden that it brought. My mother's father, Ahmed Musa Ibrahim, was an educated man, a travelled man, who had no time for these self-deluding patrician airs. He preferred to speak about justice and liberty and the right to self-fulfillment. He would pay for these words in due course. He had spent 2 years at Makerere College in Uganda and 1 year at Edinburgh University in Scotland, completing a diploma in public health. In between his studies at those two institutions, he spent several weeks in Cairo, visiting a friend who was a student in education at the American University. Then he traveled through Beirut and stayed in Istanbul for 3 weeks on his way to London. The years in Kampala and Edinburgh, and his time in those other fabulous cities, gave him an air of incomparable glamour and sophistication. And when he started to speak about one or other of the famous sights encountered on his travels, his audience fell reverently silent. Oh, that was how my mother told it, that his words were held in such respect. He worked in the laboratories of the Department of Health, a short walk from home. His main work was in the Malaria Eradication campaign, But he also contributed to the Cholera and Dysentery Control Project, analyzing samples and participating in seminars. Some people addressed him as doctor and consulted him about their ailments, but he laughed them off and told them that he worked in the rat catchers department and knew nothing about hernias and hemorrhoids and chest pains and fevers. I've seen a photograph of him at the back of the Department of Health building, near the gate to the yard where the departmental vehicles were parked. He wore a white linen suit, the middle button of his jacket done up, and a red tarbouche at a dashing angle. His head was tilted to one side, so the tassel hung a little way from the tarbouche. His right calf was crossed over his left, drawing attention to his brown shoes, and his right arm leant against the unmistakable neem tree by the gate. In the distance behind him loomed the giant flamboyant that shaded the road running by the building. He stood in a jaunty, cheery pose in which he was play-acting his modernity, a cosmopolitan traveller to some of the world's great metropolises, Cairo, Beirut, and Istanbul, on the way to London and Edinburgh. And it may have been on its way out in other places in the 1950s, Egypt, Iraq, Tunisia, where it was becoming an emblem of corrupt bashas and beys and the defeated armies of Arab nationalism. But the news had not yet reached my mother's father, at least not when the photograph was taken. To him it was still a sign of sophisticated Islamic modernity, secular and practical in place of the medieval turban. The white linen suit was more ambiguous. That it was a suit was a salute to Europe, as were the brown shoes in a sandal-wearing culture. But the suit was white, which when worn with modesty was the color of homage and prayer and pilgrimage, the color of purity and devotion. The photograph was saved from any air of vanity by the exaggerated crossing of the calves and by the uncertain, half-apologetic smile on his round, chubby face, as if he was wondering if he had gone too far in his dressing up. Yeah, Wasafiri, it's been going a while. I remember when it started, I was there. In the early stages, Sushila, of course, was always the editor, but in the early stages, I was also part of the editorial group, and for a while, it was based, the magazine, and also its, I suppose, the editorial staff, for what it's worth. I mean, there are only very few of us, were all based in Canterbury, at the University of Kent. So I had a lot to do with it for, I should think, for about until the 90s, early 90s, something like that, I think. And it's just great to see the way it's grown and grown and grown and grown till now it's a big glossy thing. Whereas when it started out, it was, you know, kind of stapled in the middle, that kind of thing. So it's terrific that it's got to be such a big, such a wide-ranging and influential magazine.